creates questions the human mind cannot answer. Out of reach, past all we can see, hear, and touch, beyond all we understand, lies the extraordinary. The extraordinary is the night Elaine Martin clearly saw the death of her husband, a vision that came true.
When I read the paper the next day, it actually said that there were huge flames and the driver could be heard screaming for help, and I knew that what I dreamt had come true.
A fiery holocaust no one could have predicted. It is the new book detailing the final days of the legendary Howard Hughes.
Howard became a prisoner of his own guards.
Murder by Neglect is written by Hughes' widow, Terry Moore, but she insists it was dictated by Howard from his grave. The extraordinary is the warning from a dead father that may have saved a life, and the ghostly appearance of the long-departed man after the accident, an image caught on film. It is the freak coincidence that saw two young lovers seal their fate. 1,000,000 to 1 chance that defies explanation.
He then said, "This is your engagement ring, and please will you marry me?"
The extraordinary is this never-before-seen vision of a UFO. Videotape captured in Melbourne in 1992.
The extraordinary thing to this was that it was a daylight sighting. That was the most important thing about this, and it's a genuine sighting.
Just some of the stories that lie beyond our normal understanding. Tonight on The Extraordinary.
That videotape is very hard to explain. Good evening, I'm Warwick Moss. The death of a loved one is always a tragedy. It can scar those left behind for the rest of their days. It's rare for anyone who's lost a husband, wife, or close friend to say the bereavement left them a stronger and better person. That's why Elaine Martin's story is so remarkable. She knew her husband Jeff was going to die, had seen how his life would end. A fiery holocaust that no one could have predicted. But Elaine Martin managed to turn the ultimate tragedy into a triumph of the human spirit. Just before 10:30, on the night of August the 22nd, 1978, a massive fuel tanker roars through the darkness of Port Adelaide, South Australia. It's headed for the Birkenhead Bridge. 31-year-old Jeffrey Martin, the father of a young family, is driving toward the same bridge. In 4 days, he's due to celebrate his 11th wedding anniversary. Jeff doesn't know it, but his wife, Elaine, has already bought him a card. It says, "Togetherness. There's nothing like it. Happy anniversary." But in a matter of minutes, that togetherness, that family, will be torn apart by a terrible accident. It was an accident that probably no one could prevent, but it was one Elaine knew was going to happen. Exactly 2 weeks before this night, Elaine had a vivid, horrifying dream.
On Tuesday the 8th of August, I woke up at 6 o'clock in the morning and I was really quite distressed. I was crying and shaking and my heart was racing and my palms were really, perspiring and I'd had this terrible dream, and I actually woke my husband up and I said to him, "I've just had the most awful dream," and I said, "I dreamt you were dead," and he actually thought I was joking and started clowning around until he realised how serious I was. And he said, what did you dream? And I said, well, all I could see was these huge flames and I could hear you screaming for help. And, you know, we just held each other really closely. I said, I just don't want to let you go because it frightened me so much. So we got up and my mother was staying with us because my father was in hospital, and Jeffrey and Mum and I were, you know, basically talking about this dream over breakfast. And, you know, when Jeff went to work, Mum was saying, don't be silly, it wouldn't happen. And I guess in my own way I put it out of my mind because it was just too horrible to think about.
As a mother, I naturally said to her, oh, don't worry, it's only a dream. And dreams don't very often come true, but this one actually did.
In more ways than one, the marriage of Elaine and Jeff Martin was a match made in heaven. They were devout Christians, cared about their community, and gave it all they could. Jeff as a Sea Scout leader and a basketball coach. In fact, that fateful night, August the 22nd, 1978, Jeff was on his way back from the local competition, driving home as the fuel tanker bore down on Birkenhead Bridge. And the irony is, by rights, Jeff Martin shouldn't have been on this stretch of road at this time. The basketball match he was due to umpire had been called off, so he set out for home an hour earlier than usual. An hour that could have meant the difference between life and death. An hour that could have made Elaine's dream irrelevant.
He wasn't going to come home from work at all that night. He was working overtime and then he was going to go straight to umpire basketball. Anyway, he didn't end up working back, so he came home and had something to eat, which I found quite incredible anyway, because we also, again, got to say, I love you and all those special kind of things.
That night, Elaine was edgy. She couldn't sleep. As the night wore on, as Jeff didn't come home, she became more and more frantic. Elaine was convinced something was wrong. She began phoning friends, hospitals, the police. But no one knew where or how Jeff was.
I was waiting for the news to come on, the radio, and at that time I heard these cars pull up in a hurry, and I started to walk down the passage and I remember praying, you know, please God, let him be all right. And then as I opened the door, I could see 2 police cars, and there was this policewoman actually walking up the path towards me, and I just knew he was dead. I could just feel it. I mean, I'd already had this strong feeling that something had happened. A petrol tanker had overturned on the Birkenhead Bridge, and Jeff Wassley had nothing to do with the accident. He was trapped between the bridge railing and the tanker. And, you know, whilst I was actually making phone calls, trying to find out where Jeffrey was, this dream had come back to me, but I pushed it away almost. I didn't want to think about it, but I just knew something had happened. And of course, when I read the paper the next day, it actually said that there were huge flames and the driver could be heard screaming for help, and I knew that what I dreamt had come true.
For Jeff Martin, there was a hero's funeral. The local newspaper seemed to say it all in the headline, "Farewell, Pied Piper." According to Elaine's mother, Edna, it was a fitting tribute. Jeff certainly was one of the best.
can say a funeral was beautiful. It was sad, but it was beautiful. And just to think that people loved him so much. And they're the memories that I have. I hold dear.
And for Elaine, even in her deepest depression, memories of her dream provided unexpected strength. She's been able to draw on that spiritual experience to move on and help others, as an author and as a counsellor.
You know, I think the things that I have learnt from my tragedy is that to live each day as though it was the last one you've got. In other words, say I'm sorry, say I love you, say what you can today.
They say that only time can mend a broken heart. To a degree, that's been true for Elaine. In the 15 years since Jeff's death, she's remarried and embarked on a whole new life. But Elaine had more than simply time, her faith and a second remarkable dream. A dream years after the accident, where Jeff appeared to let her know that everything was all right.
He was dressed in his umpire's uniform that he was actually wearing the night he died, and I said to him, how come I know you're dead, but I can see you as I knew you? And he clearly said to me, because that's the way I want you to remember me. I'm happy and I want you to be happy. And up until that point, I regularly had nightmares. And from that night on, I never had a nightmare. And my husband would tell you that it was so noticeable, the change in me. And it was like, I guess I see it like, I believe that God gives to each one of us at some time in our life something that helps us move back on in our grief. We may not be able to see it then, but when we look back, we can see something that's happened that's been the turning point. And I think because of the way Jeffrey died, you know, I just needed to see him whole.
I'm just so proud of her, the way that she's handled her grief and the way that her children have. And I mean, she even helped us through the grief. And all I can say is, in closing, that I'm a very proud mother of a very wonderful daughter.
Make us feel our minds are playing tricks. Make us feel we've heard or seen things that simply have not occurred. But when these same things happen in broad daylight, when we know the mind is clear, when we know the imagination is playing no part, the unexplained takes on a whole new sinister feel. For the first time, we are about to show you pictures of what is officially called a UFO. Pictures taken in Melbourne in 1992.
Say hello. Hello.
Just your average home video. Doting grandparents capturing the antics of their favourite grandson.
Big boy now.
A Friday afternoon in the suburbs. It's summer. It's sunny. But there is something strange in the atmosphere. Something mysterious that appears on the video. An unidentified object flying overhead. An object that cannot be explained in any earthly terms.
We call it a genuine UFO, an unidentified flying object. Now, I want to clarify this. It doesn't mean aliens, you know, from Mars. It's an object of some sort in control. You might say, why wasn't it a balloon? Well, apart from the analysis, we were able to identify, you know, by looking at it, that it wasn't a balloon, and also its height. Also, we checked with the Department of Transport and with the meteorology department to see when the balloons were launched, and there was nothing in the area. But this object is, the most important quality of the object is there's some control to it, and it's airborne and it's solid, so it's unidentified in that sense.
Melbourne, home of the famous Melbourne Cup, the Olympic Games of 1956, one of the largest cities in the Southern Hemisphere, Hardly the place you'd expect to find stark visual evidence of a UFO. Pictures that have confounded international experts.
Big, he's very big and very naughty.
It's just after lunch on the 21st of February, 1992. In the backyard of his home in the Melbourne suburb of Endeavour Hills, Rex Sarakoglu is trying to tape his young grandson for the folks back home in Turkey. It's hot, and the star of the show isn't all that easy to pin down.
I love you.
After I get tired, I have to sit because he's very naughty all the time. I'm sitting there, my camera, my hand, video camera. I saw suddenly some bright light in the sky. I think to myself, what's this?
It was, in fact, a light moving across the sky. A light that Rex saw through the viewfinder of his camera. A light his wife Fatma also observed.
Look like a ball on the sky. A very, very pearl color and moving.
Sometimes slowly moving, sometimes very fast moving.
One chance sighting, even when you know you have it on video, is easy enough to dismiss. But 6 days later, on February the 27th, at almost the same time, the object appeared again. And again, Rex had his camera handy.
After a while, he called me and he said, I saw the same thing again, come have a look. And I went and had a look, and I saw the same one again. And he told me this is the same one as last week. I said, yes, it looks like that.
By now, Rex Sarakoglu was really confused, and he felt he had to try to get some sort of official explanation. His search eventually led him to John Ocatel, a former airline pilot and an internationally recognized UFO researcher.
What we do, we take the film and then we scan it into the computer, single frame, which is digitized.
At the headquarters of Phenomenon Research Australia, and with the help of university colleagues, John fed the pictures into a number of computers. They enlarged, they analysed, they took atmospheric conditions, the location of the sun, even the condition of Rex's camera into consideration. And this is what the computer came up with regarding the first sighting on February the 21st.
Now, in this case, we're right up on the object. This object here is this is about 1.8 minutes of arc in width, and even at that blown up stage, there's no wing structure, no tail structure, and it's rounded. And when you put the rest put the line through it here, it's a flattened dome-like type of shape, but it's got the classical UFO shape. Varied in shape quite a bit. It was actually like spinning, or toppling's the best word, around an axis. It's about 23 feet wide. It's about 13.4 kilometres from the camera at an average distance. And it's moving at about, its average speed when it was moving towards the west, away from the camera, was about 300 kilometres an hour. So it wasn't going very fast at all. That's why Rex was able to monitor it for quite a while.
Actually, Rex was able to monitor it for 2, maybe 3 minutes. But what about the height of the object? 13.4 kilometres is about 8 miles. And, according to John Ocatel, that's Concorde, supersonic territory. He says that kind of aircraft would naturally have been tracked by Australian aviation authorities.
Because at that height, when they get to that height over Melbourne, they must carry a flight plan, and there was nothing unusual, and there was nothing in the area at that time.
With more help from computer enhancement, John Ockertell was able to produce these remarkable still frames of the object. They helped convince him this was, in fact, a UFO. It was not a conventional aircraft. It was not a balloon. And as far as John could tell, it was not the result of a fault in Rex's camera.
We could find no emulsion problems or, problems with the tape. It wasn't a hoax, the extraordinary thing to this was that it was a daylight sighting. That was the most important thing about this, and it's a genuine sighting.
Then there was the second sighting, the second video, taken on the afternoon of February the 27th.
So the times are very similar, and also the first and second objects are very similar in dimension and shape and doing nearly identical things, moving in also nearly the identical track, and you also note that they move off towards the antenna, then they both curl away and move off. The second one then moves off north, where the other one went west. But the interesting thing is it's nearly exactly the same thing, and he's captured the same UFO at different periods, one on the 21st and one on the 27th.
So what began as a simple family video on a summer's afternoon in Melbourne has become a scientific conundrum. The same object, in the same place, at almost the same time, sighted and taped. So paranoid and secluded was the legendary billionaire Howard Hughes at the end of his life that the rumours seemed right out of a Stephen King novel. His hair was down to his waist. His fingernails had grown so long they curled back. He was white, paper-thin and bug-eyed. How accurate those rumours were, we may never know. But an unusual insight into Hughes' last days comes from his widow. And her information, she says, comes from the spirit world.
Hughes died in 1976 at the age of 70. He remains the most legendary aviator and tycoon of the 20th century. He turned unknowns into movie queens like Lana Turner, lavished gifts and his affection on countless Hollywood stars, broke global flight records, and gave the world its biggest airplane, the Spruce Goose. Yet in the final decades of his life, Hughes disappeared from view, and many suspected from reality. He became the world's most famous hermit, holed up in his Las Vegas hotel penthouse, surrounded by an impenetrable phalanx of aides and security guards. It is this final period, ending in his death as an emaciated, malnourished old man, that has remained a dark mystery, perhaps until now. A new book is about to be published in the U.S. by one-time actress Terry Moore, who remains his official widow since a court ruled that she was indeed secretly married to Hughes for 8 years. The book is called Murder by Neglect.
People wonder, and they should, how a billionaire could die of malnutrition and dehydration when every form of medicine was at his fingertips. But as I always said, Howard became a prisoner of his own guards.
It is Moore's second book about Howard Hughes. The first was called The Beauty and the Billionaire. But this one is different. Hughes, she says, dictated every word from the grave, chapters about people she never knew, never met.
There's no way that it could be me writing the book, because if you read the style on my book, telling it from a young girl's viewpoint, it was completely different. Howard was compelling me, imploring me, begging me to write the story, his story, what really happened, what he believed that happened to him, that he was murdered by neglect. Howard would come to me in dreams, and it was very, very clear of what he felt happened. And he was very dramatic, very incensed, and it was like he couldn't rest until his story had been told. Often when I would sit at a typewriter, it just seemed like my hands would fly over the keys. Names came back to me that I'd completely forgotten if I'd ever known before. And when I would do research, I would find those names and those people, and even people that he knew before I knew him.
The story Moore tells, or Hughes tells, is of a lonely old man with $26 billion, surrounded by men who wanted control, cut off from relatives, friends, and the outside world.
The sad part is that Howard never knew that his friends were trying to reach him. Cary Grant and many of his friends were calling all the time, and they were told that Howard thanked them for their calls, but that could not talk to them at this time. He thought that nobody cared in the end. He had no idea that he did have other friends and other people who loved him and liked him and would have done anything to have helped him. He said that he was being held prisoner right up until the time he died. He told me that he was not allowed to make any phone calls. He was told that people were after him, that there was no way that he could break away.
And finally, in one of his last conversations from the beyond, Moore says Howard gave her the order.
Howard said to me, "Terry, I want you to write this book."
Why?
Because I can never rest until the true story is brought out.
It's said that love triumphs over all. Many people believe that to be true. For those who don't, perhaps this story will change their minds. Love just didn't have to triumph over normal barriers for this young English woman and her German sailor. It had to beat impossible odds to come up with a freak coincidence. It's 1977, a typical Christmas day in England, cold and bleak. But in one Bristol house, there's warmth, excitement, and romance. On this day, the lives of Joy Ames and Hans Eelgood are about to be transformed in a fairy tale fashion. It's a story of lovers separated by the sea, a reunion, and a tiny band of gold. A story that began 6 months earlier, in June 1977.
My friend and I were sitting in my lounge drinking coffee, and we suddenly heard an announcement on the radio that a fleet of German ships were coming into Bristol docks, and how would you girls out there like to invite some of these hunky fellas home for lunch and show them some good old English hospitality. And we both looked at one another and giggled and thought, wow, it sounds really good. How about it?
Those sailors were headed for Bristol. It was to be the first goodwill visit to England by the German Navy since the end of World War II. On board one of the patrol boats was young Hans Eelgood, who shot this 8mm film. He and his shipmates were looking forward to their stay in Bristol. They'd help bury the wounds of war. They'd meet the English as friends, not enemies. When the German fleet reached Bristol, Joy Ames was on the docks to welcome the sailors, and there was something about one of them that caught her attention.
His big basset-hound eyes. There's something about him that I just, wanted to take him home with me.
That sailor was Hans Eelgood, and take him home she did. At that stage, just for dinner and a drink.
I didn't know if she was involved with somebody, and I really fancied her. She was nice looking, and I was really drawn to her. And I thought, I have to see her again.
I picked up the phone after 2 days, and this fella kept saying, I come, and I said, well, who's coming? And of course, whoever was on the end of the phone couldn't tell me who he was. And I said, oh, all right then, presuming that it was one of the Germans from the ship, and sort of hoping that it was Hans, and got myself all ready and excited and said, oh, please God, I hope it's Hans. And then the doorbell rang, and as I opened the door, it was Hans. And that was the start of our romance, I suppose.
The start and possibly the end. Just as that romance was blossoming, Hans and his shipmates had to set sail for home.
All of a sudden, they all lined up on the top of all these 6 boats in the mothership and saluted us, and all of a sudden this music came, we are sailing. Oh, and everybody, when you looked around, everybody was crying, and I just sort of bowed my head and couldn't look anymore as they all went off down through the docks and out into the channel. And I went home and I thought, well, that's it, I'll never see him again.
For Hans, though, Joy wasn't just another girl in another port. He began bombarding her with letters and postcards, all of them declaring his undying love. Then, as 1977 drew to a close, Hans announced he was being demobbed. He'd be out of the Navy by the end of December, and he wanted to spend Christmas in Bristol with Joy.
I didn't earn very much. And when I heard that Hans was coming to stay for Christmas, I was very worried, because I had enough money for us to eat generally, but I hadn't got enough money for special food, you know, turkey and ham and that type of thing. And of course I wanted to buy him a little present as well. And I went through all the cupboards and the drawers and looking to see what I could possibly sell. And I came across this little toffee tin, and it had some paste jewellery in it, and it was from my auntie Doll, actually, who died in 1962. And I suddenly found this little tiny ring, and I thought, oh, it's so tiny, nobody will give me anything for it, but I'll try.
Nervously clutching Aunt Dolly's diamond ring, Joy went looking for someone who'd buy it. Eventually, she came across a tiny jeweller's shop, hidden away in a Bristol lane. A shop that until then, she didn't even know existed. At first, the jeweller wasn't all that impressed with the heirloom, but she decided that maybe the little diamond was worth something. Say, around £25.
25 quid.
I was thrilled and tucked my money away and thought, well, at least now I've got something towards Christmas. I can buy good food and perhaps a little present for Hans for Christmas. Never gave the ring another thought. That was it. Finished as far as I was concerned. Although I did feel guilty and hoped my auntie wouldn't haunt me for giving her jewellery away.
By now, it's Christmas Eve. Hans has arrived in Bristol. He's having a couple of beers to build up his courage for the coming reunion with his sweetheart. He's already bought some gifts, but he thinks he needs another. Something special. A piece of jewellery. A delicate diamond ring.
It was in my mind to use it as an engagement ring, but I thought I'd figure first out how the reaction is when I go there. If she reacts all right, then I propose and use it as an engagement ring. Otherwise, it would be only a present.
The next morning, there were gifts galore and surprises all round. Joy's £25 had stocked the larder and decorated the tree. Hans, too, had found exactly what he was looking for.
When we decided there was no more, I said, OK, we'll get breakfast. Hans says to me, but you've forgotten one. I said, no, I haven't. There's nothing left. Oh, yes, you've forgotten one, look. And I looked on the tray and there was this little tiny packet. Guilty. I sort of went up and took it off and opened it up. Now imagine my shock when I opened it up. And instead of being happy and saying thank you, I opened it up and there was my ring. And I just looked at him and I said, where the hell did you get that ring from?
You guessed it. Hans had got it from a tiny jeweller's shop hidden away in a Bristol lane. Remember, there were scores of jewellery shops in Bristol. As luck would have it, Hans chose this one. Not only the same jeweller's shop, the very same ring. The one Joy inherited from her Aunt Dolly and was forced to pawn so that she and Hans could have their Christmas together.
I was so embarrassed. I felt I had to tell him, my position, that I wasn't well off at all, and that I'd sold the ring to buy food and a present for him for Christmas. I mean, I wasn't sure how he'd react to this, but he was quite charming, and he said, well, he was obviously meant to keep it.
It's actually unbelievable, and it's such a tiny ring. It's like finding a needle in a haystack, I guess.
Now, in any fairy tale romance, there has to be a fairy tale wedding. Hans and Joy had theirs. Not all that long after that momentous Christmas day, they were married.
It didn't fit then, and it doesn't fit now. But he then said, this is your engagement ring, and please will you marry me? So obviously I'll never part with the ring.
Is it possible for those who have passed on to make contact with those still living? Can the departed watch over loved ones they've left behind? Can they pass on warnings from the afterlife? There's no definitive answer, but sometimes things occur that truly make us think. For more than 20 years, Anne Daly and her husband Owen lived in the same house. It was comfortable, surrounded by gardens and trees in Sydney's northern suburbs. It was quiet. The neighbours were friendly. The kind of place where nothing much out of the ordinary ever happens. That was until the night of August the 2nd in 1990, when a chain of events began. Events that defy explanation.
I went to sleep, and then I don't remember what time it was, but sometime during the night I just seemed to get this exceptionally strong message that made me wake up. And the message was, the tree next door is going to fall on your house.
I said, oh, don't be silly, you're just having a dream. There'd been some storms around at the time. I said, you're just having a dream, go back to sleep. She said, no, I've had this really strong premonition that a tree's going to fall on the house. And we'd never had anything like that before, but I still wasn't convinced, and I just said, look, just roll over and go back to bed.
The next morning, that premonition was still playing on Anne's mind. As she prepared for work, she thought about it more and more. There hadn't really been a voice. There certainly hadn't been a ghost. But there had been a clear warning. And somehow, Anne felt that warning had come from her dead father, that somehow he was watching over her. Anne was so concerned she took some precautions, just to be on the safe side.
I never ever lock my animals in the house, but my little Maltese sleeps under a tree which was near the tree, so I thought maybe if it fell she could be under it at the time. So I locked her in the house and went off to work. And Dally, can I help you?
An hour later, it happened. A phone call from a neighbour telling Anne exactly what she'd feared. What she'd known was going to happen. The tree next door had crashed to the ground, into the Daly house.
I wasn't terribly shocked because I was expecting it to happen. When I came home, I was fairly horrified because there was quite a lot of mess and I couldn't see what sort of damage had been done to the house.
A dream, a warning beyond the grave. Well, we certainly know the disaster did happen, as predicted. Anne Daly has the photographs to prove it. And she's convinced one of those photos proves something else. Something quite eerie. That her dead father was in fact watching over her. The photographs were taken for the insurance companies. At the time, it all seemed pretty routine, just the thing you do after an accident. Some were taken by the owner of the tree, David O'Brien, some by Anne herself.
I had mine developed and there was nothing abnormal in them. And then when I saw this photograph that David had taken, I was convinced that it was my father standing in the window, and my father had died 3 years before.
Anne Daly's father had died at the age of 89. So, if it was him looking down from the window, why does the image seem to be that of a much younger man? Well, Anne found the answer in the family album, a photograph of her parents' wedding, taken more than 40 years earlier. She's convinced this shot of her father is the spitting image of the mysterious man in the window. Her neighbours, David and Cheryl O'Brien, now think so too.
You know, I had no idea who it was. It didn't mean anything to me, and Anne said that, you know, it looked very like her father. And it's only fairly recently that she said, you know, she had a photograph, a wedding photograph, I think it was, where she said it looked very much like it. And she showed it to us, and, you know, you can see very real resemblance. There's no problem about resemblance.
And I couldn't have identified it as a person, but I've always been rather sceptical of photos that, you know, people have said had ghosts in them. But I know this photo wasn't doctored. So, you know, if there was something there, it was there when the photo was taken. And when Anne showed us the wedding photo, it certainly looked like the father. That helped to give an image to what was in the window.
We were very close towards the last few years, and I remember having him in my home one day, and I was sitting at the kitchen table, and I said, "When you pass over, if you can possibly come back and let me know that you're all right, will you do that?" And he just laughed because he didn't believe in a life hereafter, and he just said, "When you're dead, Anne, that's it." So I said, "Yes, but if you can, will you do it?" And he just laughed and didn't answer me. And it was 3 years later that I was convinced he was letting me know that he was just around.
It is the Shakespearean play that actors refuse to name. A dark and dangerous tale of murder and evil.
Double, double, toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble.
Some say the play is cursed. Those who have faced the curse say it is real.
Some extraordinary things happened. It's the only time in the history of the ensemble theatre that we had to cancel opening night because the lead lost his voice.
That play, the Scottish play, next week.
Oh, this is so!
The bizarre story of That Scottish Play and its litany of disaster. Don't miss it. Also next week, the family in France that has had its life almost destroyed by things that go bump in the night. For now, good night. See you in the future.
I had a very strong sense that there were forces inside the house trying to harm me. Spirits can be very powerful. They're very clever. They're very strong.
Bon, ça vient, ça commence.